Untold Stories, Before the Bell Witch, The Forbidden Diaries of the McCormick Haunting Chapter 1. The arrival. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling Tennessee farmland. The McCormick family's wagon creaked to a halt in front of their new home, a grand yet slightly dilapidated farmhouse that had stood empty for years. The white paint was chipped, and ivy had begun to reclaim the walls, but to the McCormicks, it was a fresh start. Mr. McCormick, a tall man with a graying beard, jumped down from the wagon and stretched. "Well, here we are," he declared, looking up at the house with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His wife, a petite woman with a stern face, nodded. "It's charming," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of doubt. Their two children, Thomas and young Eliza, were more enthusiastic. Thomas, a strapping lad of 17, was already dreaming of all the adventures he'd have on the vast property. Eliza, with her golden curls and wide blue eyes, was more intrigued by the house itself. As the family began to unload their belongings, Eliza wandered off, drawn to the house like a moth to a flame. The heavy wooden door creaked open at her touch, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of age and decay was unmistakable. Eliza's footsteps echoed as she ventured further inside, her curiosity getting the better of her. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves. She paused, straining her ears. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, though she couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the hallway, causing the candles on the walls to flicker. Eliza shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She was about to turn back when she noticed a vase on a nearby table. As she watched, it began to wobble, then tipped over, shattering on the ground. Startled, Eliza let out a scream. The family dog, Rufus, who had been exploring the grounds, came bounding to her side. But instead of entering the house, he stopped at the threshold, barking furiously at something inside. His hackles raised, and his eyes were filled with terror. Eliza, now thoroughly spooked, decided to retreat. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the corner of her eye. It was tall and thin, with long, flowing hair. It seemed to be watching her, though she couldn't see its face. Heart pounding, Eliza ran back to her family, who were setting up camp outside the house. "There's someone in there," she cried, pointing at the house. Mr. McCormick frowned, grabbing a lantern and heading inside. But after a thorough search, he found no one. "It's just your imagination, Eliza," he said gently, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. That night, as the family settled into their new home, the strange occurrences continued. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Eliza, lying in bed, could hear the whispers again, growing louder and more insistent. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to block out the noise. But as she was drifting off to sleep, she felt a cold hand brush against her cheek. Eyes snapping open, she saw the shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. Frozen in fear, Eliza could only watch as the figure slowly faded away, leaving her in darkness. She knew one thing for certain: their new home was not as idyllic as it seemed. And whatever was haunting, it had taken an interest in her. The stage was set for a series of events that would forever change the McCormick family, as they found themselves in the grip of a malevolent force that would not rest until it had claimed them all. Chapter 2. Unsettling Dreams. The first night in the McCormick farmhouse was restless. The wind howled outside, causing the old wooden beams to creak and groan. But it wasn't just the house's age that kept the family awake. As the moon rose high, a palpable sense of dread settled over the household. Mrs. McCormick was the first to succumb to the nightmares. In her dream, she found herself standing in the middle of a dense forest. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was littered with bones, and as she looked down, she realized they were human. A chilling scream pierced the air, and she woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. Mr. McCormick's dream was no less terrifying. He dreamt of the house, but it was different, older, more decrepit. He wandered its halls, searching for his family, but all he found were rooms filled with old, rotting furniture and walls stained with blood. A shadowy figure lurked in the corners, always just out of sight, its laughter echoing through the house. Eliza's dreams were the most disturbing of all. She dreamt of the land's dark history, of rituals and sacrifices performed under the cover of night. She saw herself, bound and gagged, being led to an altar by hooded figures. As the knife descended, she would jolt awake, gasping for breath. But it wasn't just the dreams that plagued Eliza. She began to sleepwalk, wandering the house in a trance-like state. More than once, Mrs. McCormick found her standing in front of a locked door in the basement, her fingers scratching at the wood as if trying to get in. The whispers that had once been faint and indistinct grew louder and more menacing. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, taunting the family with their secrets. "Leave. While you still can," they hissed, their voices dripping with malice. Thomas, always the skeptic, tried to dismiss the strange occurrences as mere coincidences. But even he couldn't ignore the deep, unexplained scratches that appeared on his arms one morning. They burned and itched, and no matter what he did, they wouldn't heal. The family was on edge, snapping at each other over the smallest things. The once promising fresh start had turned into a nightmare, and they were trapped in its grip. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, the whispers grew louder than ever. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding the family. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold wind blew through the house, extinguishing the fireplace and leaving the family in complete darkness. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. The family scrambled to their feet, trying to find the source of the noise. But all they found was Eliza, standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with terror. "She's here," she whispered, pointing to the shadowy figure that now stood at the foot of the stairs. The figure raised its hand, and the house was plunged into chaos. Objects flew off shelves, windows shattered, and the walls seemed to close in on the family. As quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The figure was gone, and the house was silent once more. But the damage was done. The family was shaken to its core, and they knew that they were not alone. The next morning, the family gathered in the living room, trying to make sense of what had happened. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, they found an old woman standing there, her eyes filled with sadness. "I tried to warn you," she said, her voice trembling. "This land is cursed, and you are its next victims." The family looked at each other in horror, realizing that their nightmare was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The first possession. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the McCormick household. But the serenity was short-lived. Mrs. McCormick, usually the pillar of strength and grace, began to exhibit strange behaviors that sent shivers down the spines of her family. It started subtly. She would stand in the middle of a room, staring blankly at the walls, lost in a trance. But as days passed, her actions grew more erratic. She would burst into fits of laughter at inappropriate times or become inexplicably enraged over trivial matters. One evening, as the family sat for dinner, Mrs. McCormick began to speak in a language none of them recognized. Her voice, usually soft and melodic, was now guttural and harsh. She spoke of events from the past, secrets of the house, and tragedies that had befallen previous inhabitants, details she couldn't possibly have known. Thomas, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, attempted to calm his mother. "Mother, you're not making any sense," he pleaded. But Mrs. McCormick's gaze was distant, her eyes glazed over as if she were in another world. Desperate for answers and fearing for their mother's sanity, the family sought the help of Father O'Malley, the local priest known for his deep knowledge of the spiritual realm. Father O'Malley arrived, his face etched with concern. After listening to the family's account, he agreed that something supernatural was at play. "We must act quickly," he urged, "before the entity strengthens its hold." The living room was transformed into a makeshift sanctuary. Candles were lit, and holy relics were placed around Mrs. McCormick, who now lay on a couch, her breathing shallow. Father O'Malley began the exorcism, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water. As the priest's chants grew louder, the atmosphere in the room became oppressive. The temperature dropped, and a chilling wind seemed to emanate from Mrs. McCormick herself. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, with a force that no one expected, Mrs. McCormick levitated off the couch. Her eyes, once a soft brown, were now pitch black, void of any emotion. A guttural voice, not her own, echoed through the room. "You cannot save her," it hissed. In a swift, violent motion, an unseen force hurled Father O'Malley against the wall. The impact was so strong that it left a dent in the wooden paneling. The family watched in horror, paralyzed by fear. Mrs. McCormick, or the entity controlling her, slowly descended back onto the couch. Her voice, dripping with malice, uttered a chilling prophecy. "The land is cursed, and all who dwell here shall suffer. Your fate is sealed, and doom awaits." The room fell silent, the only sound being the ragged breathing of the terrified family. Father O'Malley, bruised but determined, rose to his feet. "This is just the beginning," he warned. "The entity is powerful, and it won't let go easily." As night fell, the McCormick family huddled together, united in their fear. The once promising new start had turned into a living nightmare, and they were trapped in its grip. The battle for Mrs. McCormick's soul had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 4. The haunting intensifies. The days that followed were a blur of terror for the McCormick family. The once grand farmhouse, with its promise of new beginnings, had become a prison of supernatural horrors. The poltergeist activities, which had started as mere nuisances, escalated to dangerous levels. Plates and glasses would suddenly fly off shelves, narrowly missing family members. Chairs would be violently pulled out from under them, and doors would slam shut with such force that the windows would rattle. One evening, as the family sat in the dimly lit living room, the haunting took a deeply personal turn. The soft, familiar voice of Mrs. McCormick's deceased mother filled the room. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, filled with sorrow. Mr. McCormick, in a state of shock, heard the voice of his late brother, taunting him with past regrets. The entity was no longer just attacking them physically, it was waging psychological warfare. Eliza, already traumatized by her earlier encounters, faced a new horror. As she lay in bed, trying to find solace in sleep, an invisible force gripped her. She felt herself being lifted off the mattress, her hands flailing as she tried to grab onto something. Suspended in midair, she could see the shadowy figure from her earlier visions, its eyes gleaming with malevolence. With a sudden jolt, she was dropped back onto the bed, gasping for breath. The nights were no longer silent. The unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the wooden floors echoed through the house. Knocking, persistent and rhythmic, resonated from within the walls, as if someone or something was trying to break free. Thomas, driven by a mix of fear and determination, decided it was time to uncover the truth. He began to delve into the history of the house, searching for any clues that might explain the haunting. He visited the local library, poring over old newspapers and property records. He spoke to the town's elders, listening intently to their tales of the farmhouse and its dark past. What he discovered was chilling. The house had been built on land that was once a burial ground for a forgotten tribe. Legends spoke of rituals and ceremonies, of a powerful shaman who had been betrayed by his own people. It was said that his spirit, filled with rage and sorrow, still roamed the land, seeking vengeance. As Thomas dug deeper, he uncovered more recent tragedies. A series of owners who had met untimely and violent deaths. Families torn apart by madness and despair. It was clear that the McCormicks were not the first to suffer at the hands of the vengeful spirit, and unless they found a way to break the curse, they wouldn't be the last. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas returned to the farmhouse, determined to save his family. But as he stepped through the front door, he realized that the entity was already aware of his discoveries. The temperature in the house dropped, and a voice, colder and more menacing than ever, echoed through the halls. "You cannot escape your fate," it hissed. The haunting had intensified, and the McCormick family was in a race against time. The entity was growing stronger, feeding off their fear. They had to find a way to banish it, or they would become its next victims. Chapter 5. Unearthing the past. The old attic of the McCormick farmhouse was a place few dared to tread. Dust hung thick in the air, and cobwebs draped from the rafters like ancient curtains. It was here, amidst forgotten trunks and moth-eaten drapes, that Thomas stumbled upon a collection of old journals. Their leather bindings were worn, and their pages yellowed with age. As he leafed through the journals, Thomas was drawn into a world of darkness and despair. The entries, written in a shaky hand, spoke of rituals performed under the cloak of night, of sacrifices made to appease an ancient entity. The more he read, the more he realized that the entity that tormented his family had a long and bloody history. One journal, dated over a century ago, belonged to a woman named Abigail. Her writings revealed the torment she and her family endured. "It watches us," she wrote. "It takes pleasure in our pain. We are its playthings, and there is no escape." As Thomas delved deeper into Abigail's entries, he came across a chilling revelation. The entity had a name, one whispered in fear by those who knew of its existence: the Bell Witch. A particular entry caught Thomas's attention. Abigail wrote of a cryptic warning she had found etched into the wall of the basement: "Beware the witch's wrath." The message was clear, and its implications terrifying. The Bell Witch would not be denied her vengeance. Determined to share his findings with the family, Thomas hurried downstairs. But as he reached the bottom step, he felt an invisible force push him back. Doors slammed shut, and windows latched on their own. The house was in lockdown, and an oppressive atmosphere settled over it. Panicking, Mr. McCormick tried to force the front door open, but it wouldn't budge. "We need to get out," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But the house, or rather the entity controlling it, had other plans. Amidst the chaos, a horrifying realization dawned on Mrs. McCormick. "Where's Eliza?" she cried, her eyes darting around the room. The family searched frantically, calling out her name, but there was no response. Eliza had vanished. The dim light of the evening cast eerie shadows on the walls as the family regrouped in the living room. The weight of their situation was suffocating. Not only were they trapped, but one of their own was missing, possibly at the mercy of the malevolent force that haunted them. Thomas, clutching the old journals, spoke up. "We need to understand our enemy if we're to have any hope of defeating it," he said, his voice trembling. He shared his discoveries with the family, and as they listened, a grim determination settled over them. They were up against an ancient evil, one that had claimed countless victims over the centuries. But they were not going to go down without a fight. The McCormicks were determined to reclaim their home and save Eliza, no matter the cost. As the night wore on, the haunting intensified. Whispers turned into screams, and the very walls seemed to come alive. But the McCormicks held their ground, united in their resolve. The battle for their home and their lives had begun, and they were in it together. But as dawn approached, they couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Bell Witch was just getting started. Chapter 6. Descent into madness. The days following Eliza's disappearance were a blur of anguish and dread. The once cohesive McCormick family began to unravel, their bonds strained by the relentless torment of the Bell Witch. But no one was more affected than Mr. McCormick. His once sturdy demeanor began to crumble. Shadows under his eyes deepened, and he would often be found muttering to himself, casting suspicious glances at his family. The weight of being the head of the household, responsible for the safety of his loved ones, was taking its toll. He became convinced that the entity was not just an external threat but had infiltrated the minds of his family, turning them against one another. One evening, as the family sat in the dimly lit dining room, a seemingly innocuous comment from Thomas about the state of the house set Mr. McCormick off. "You think this is my fault, don't you?" he snapped, his voice rising with every word. "You think I brought this curse upon us?" Thomas, taken aback, tried to calm his father. "No, Father, I didn't mean." But Mr. McCormick wasn't listening. He lunged at Thomas, his hands reaching for his son's throat. Mrs. McCormick screamed, rushing forward to pull her husband off. The dining room descended into chaos, with furniture overturned and precious heirlooms shattered. As the dust settled, the family, panting and bruised, looked at each other with a mix of fear and disbelief. The entity was winning, driving a wedge between them. The house itself seemed to be in league with the Bell Witch. Doors that once led to familiar rooms now opened to unfamiliar, endless corridors that twisted and turned, leading nowhere. Mrs. McCormick, in a desperate search for Eliza, found herself trapped in one such corridor. The walls seemed to close in on her, and no matter how far she walked, she couldn't find an exit. It was only the sound of Thomas's voice, calling out to her, that led her back to reality. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Late one night, as a storm raged outside, a soft, familiar voice echoed through the house. "Mother? Father?" It was Eliza. The family rushed to the source of the voice, finding Eliza standing at the top of the staircase. But something was off. Her once bright blue eyes were now a dull gray, devoid of emotion. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she moved with a stiffness that was unnatural. "Eliza!" Mrs. McCormick cried, rushing to embrace her daughter. But Eliza didn't respond. She just stood there, staring blankly ahead. As the family tried to make sense of Eliza's condition, the house came alive. Windows shattered, sending shards of glass flying. The wind howled, and the very foundations of the house seemed to shake. Amidst the chaos, Eliza spoke, her voice cold and distant. "She's here," she whispered. "And she's angry." The family looked at each other in horror, realizing that their ordeal was far from over. The Bell Witch had returned, and she was more powerful than ever. Chapter 7. The Witch's Vendetta. The McCormick farmhouse, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now stood as a monument to terror. Its walls, which had witnessed countless joys and sorrows over the centuries, now echoed with the malevolent laughter of the Bell Witch. As the days turned into nights and the nights into days, the distinction between reality and nightmare became blurred for the McCormick family. But on one fateful evening, the true nature of their tormentor was revealed. The living room, with its grand fireplace and ornate furnishings, was bathed in an eerie green glow. The family, drawn by an unseen force, gathered there. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, but her features were twisted and grotesque, a reflection of the centuries of rage and hatred that had consumed her. "I am the Bell Witch," she hissed, her voice echoing through the room. "Wronged, betrayed, and left to rot. But death could not hold me. I have returned to claim what is rightfully mine." As she spoke, the family was bombarded with visions. Visions of the witch's past, of her being accused of dark practices, of her being hunted down by the very people she had once called friends. They saw her final moments, bound to a stake, flames licking at her feet as she screamed out her curse. "You are descendants of those who wronged me," the witch continued, her eyes fixed on the McCormicks. "And for that, you shall pay." The family, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the witch unleashed her fury upon them. They were tormented with visions of their worst fears. Mr. McCormick saw himself being buried alive, the weight of the earth pressing down on him. Thomas was chased by a horde of shadowy figures, their hands reaching out to drag him into the abyss. Eliza was trapped in a room with no doors or windows, the walls closing in on her. But the witch's cruelty knew no bounds. "I will release you from this torment," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "But only if you sacrifice one of your own." The family looked at each other in horror, the weight of the witch's words sinking in. Could they really turn on one of their own to save themselves? As they grappled with the impossible choice, Mrs. McCormick, her eyes glazed over, began to move. Drawn by an unseen force, she took Eliza by the hand and led her to the kitchen. The family, realizing what was about to happen, tried to intervene, but they were held back by an invisible barrier. In the kitchen, Mrs. McCormick filled the sink with water. Her movements were mechanical, as if she were in a trance. Holding Eliza's head, she began to push it towards the water. Eliza struggled, her eyes wide with terror. "Mother, please," she cried, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Just as it seemed that all hope was lost, Thomas, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, broke through the barrier. He lunged at his mother, pulling her away from Eliza just in time. The family, shaken to their core, regrouped in the living room. The witch's laughter echoed through the house, a chilling reminder of the danger they were in. "We need to find a way to banish her," Thomas declared, his voice filled with determination. "Before she tears us apart." The McCormicks were in a race against time, pitted against an ancient evil that would stop at nothing to exact its revenge. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome was far from certain. Chapter 8. The desperate ritual. The dim light of dawn filtered through the tattered curtains of the McCormick farmhouse. The once grand home now bore the scars of the relentless haunting, its walls charred and its floors stained. But amidst the chaos and despair, a glimmer of hope emerged. Thomas, having spent countless hours poring over the old journals, stumbled upon a passage that spoke of a ritual to banish dark entities. The instructions were detailed, requiring specific incantations, symbols, and ingredients. But most importantly, it required unity and unwavering belief from those performing it. Gathering the family in the living room, Thomas laid out the plan. "This might be our only chance," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to try." The family, though battered and broken, nodded in agreement. They set about gathering the necessary items: a silver chalice filled with spring water, candles made of beeswax, and a circle drawn with salt. At the center of the circle, they placed an old locket, a family heirloom said to possess protective properties. As night fell, the family began the ritual. They stood hand in hand, reciting the incantations inscribed in the journal. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But the Bell Witch would not be banished so easily. With a deafening roar, she made her presence known. The house shook, and the windows shattered. The circle of salt was disrupted, breaking the protective barrier. In a desperate bid to stop the ritual, the witch summoned flames. They erupted from the floorboards, quickly spreading and engulfing the room. The heat was intense, and the smoke made it difficult to breathe. But amidst the chaos, a transformation occurred. Eliza, who had been the most affected by the haunting, stood tall. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now burned with determination. She stepped forward, confronting the witch. "You will not harm my family any longer," she declared, her voice unwavering. The witch, taken aback by Eliza's newfound strength, hesitated. It was the opening Eliza needed. Drawing upon the energy of the ritual and the love she felt for her family, she unleashed a blinding light. The light engulfed the house, banishing the darkness and the malevolent presence that had plagued the McCormicks. The flames were extinguished, and the house, though damaged, stood tall. As the light faded, the family found themselves standing in the living room, the remnants of the ritual scattered around them. They looked at each other, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Eliza, exhausted but triumphant, collapsed into her mother's arms. "It's over," she whispered. The family, united in their love and determination, had faced an ancient evil and emerged victorious. The Bell Witch was gone, banished to the shadows from whence she came. But the McCormicks knew that their ordeal had changed them forever. They had seen the depths of darkness and the power of light. And they would carry the scars of their battle, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Chapter 9. The aftermath. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the Tennessee countryside, but the McCormick farmhouse stood as a stark contrast to the serene landscape. Its once grand structure was now a charred skeleton, a testament to the horrors that had transpired within its walls. Inside, amidst the ash and rubble, lay Eliza. Her clothes were singed, and her face was smeared with soot, but she was alive. Thomas, his heart pounding, rushed to her side, cradling her in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse weak, but she was alive. A small miracle amidst the devastation. But as the family took stock of their surroundings, a horrifying realization dawned upon them. Mrs. McCormick was nowhere to be found. They searched the ruins, calling out her name, but there was no response. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The weight of their losses, both material and emotional, bore down on the McCormicks. The house, their sanctuary and the embodiment of their dreams, was gone. And with Mrs. McCormick's unexplained disappearance, the family felt a void that could never be filled. "We can't stay here," Thomas declared, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "This land is cursed. We need to leave and never look back." The family, with heavy hearts, packed what little belongings they could salvage. They hitched their horses to a wagon, and as they prepared to depart, they took one last look at the ruins of their home. But as they made their way down the dirt road, a chilling sound echoed through the air, the unmistakable laughter of the Bell Witch. It was a haunting reminder that, while they may have escaped the clutches of the entity, its presence would forever be a part of their lives. The laughter grew fainter as the McCormicks put distance between themselves and the cursed land. But the scars of their ordeal, both physical and emotional, would remain with them forever. As they journeyed on, the family clung to each other, finding strength in their unity. They had faced unimaginable horrors and had emerged, albeit battered and broken, on the other side. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were determined to rebuild their lives, far away from the shadow of the Bell Witch. But one question lingered in their minds, a question that would haunt them for the rest of their days. What had happened to Mrs. McCormick? And would they ever see her again? Chapter 10. The legacy time has a way of healing wounds, but some scars run too deep to ever truly fade. The land where the McCormick farmhouse once stood became a testament to such scars. Overgrown with weeds and thorns, the charred remains of the house were a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. Birds never sang, and animals steered clear. The land was tainted, and nature itself seemed to recognize it. As the years passed, the story of the McCormick family's ordeal became the stuff of legend in the nearby town. Whispers of the cursed estate spread like wildfire, with tales of ghostly apparitions, eerie sounds, and the malevolent Bell Witch who had claimed the land as her own. Parents warned their children to stay away, and the once thriving estate became a desolate no-man's land. But as with all tales, the truth behind the McCormick story became distorted with time. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and for a new generation, the cursed estate was nothing more than a spooky tale told around campfires. It was during this time of forgotten truths that the Bell family, seeking a fresh start, moved to the neighboring land. They were drawn to the beauty of the Tennessee countryside, blissfully unaware of the dark history that lurked just beyond their property line. John Bell, the patriarch of the family, was a pragmatic man. He had heard the rumors about the McCormick estate but dismissed them as mere superstitions. He was determined to build a prosperous life for his family, and nothing, not even ghost stories, would deter him. But the Bell Witch had been patient. Having tasted the torment of the McCormicks, she hungered for more. The arrival of the Bells was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She watched from the shadows, biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the Bells settled into their new life, strange occurrences began to plague them. Whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. The family, initially dismissive, soon realized that they were not alone. The witch, emboldened by her previous conquest, was more relentless than ever. She reveled in the Bells' fear, feeding off their despair. The once peaceful Tennessee countryside became a battleground, with the Bells fighting for their very souls. And so, the legacy of the McCormick estate lived on. The land, forever tainted by the malevolence of the Bell Witch, claimed new victims. The Bells, like the McCormicks before them, were ensnared in a web of terror, their fate sealed. The story comes full circle, ending where it began, with the Bell family's ordeal. The legacy of the cursed land, and the malevolent entity that haunted it, would live on, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. We hope you have enjoyed our paranormal scary untold story about the McCormick family. Please visit us at Paranormal Untold Stories. Come to listen to more of our scary stories collection. Paranormal Untold Stories encourages you to contact us if you have your own untold story that you would like our professionals team to put online as a scary story. Thank you. Please follow our YouTube channel, Paranormal Untold Stories, and encourage others to do the same. Paranormal Untold Stories.